This is based on a hypothetical scenario where I am asked to consult and provide a 5-year budget plan that will support the client's stratagem and vision. The list of the specifics provided to me has been highlighted in my written report submitted along with this presentation, which includes the scenario, financial assumptions, and requirements. The bottom line is the client wants to determine whether this venture will support an income of $40,000 a year, as well as a 2% of increase in profits annually in an upcoming neighborhood in Orlando, Florida. As mentioned, the presentation as well as the submitted proposal highlights the following and the key points that will be discussed as follows: the executive summary, the sales forecast, capital expenditures, the initial analysis, the pro forma income statements, balance sheet, and cash flow, and a secondary analysis on financial ratios. Before I get into it, Before I get into the budget proposal, I want to just bring up to your attention that in the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. The reason being is although budgeting and forecasting is a necessary step in planning, it is a numbers-driven analysis. There are numerous things that you must consider. Amongst them are the current conditions, risk, whether you are flexible in your initial requirements, and what are the trade-offs of a specific venture. As you will see in this presentation, opportunities are not always black and white, and historical values and assumptions do not always guarantee future results. With that said, let's get right into it. I want to start with the sales forecast. The sales forecast is the beginning point of any forecasting budget plan. To determine these values, we use a number of qualitative and quantitative measures. The first matter I want to address is the lack of competitors in the provided scenario, as well as the market data. So we use the Delphi method, which questions several subject matter experts individually to forecast these results. Secondly, we also used market surveys, examining the neighborhood and other towns nearby to establish a basis and baseline for the presentation. Based on the available capacity of the restaurant and acquired data from these methods, we made several assumptions and determined that the average number of hours a family tends to sit and occupy the assigned tables, which is 2 hours. The reports determined when consumers go out to eat and providing occupancy rates for such time periods. The increase of 1% sales based on a seating occupancy and a 6% population growth within the Orlando, Florida region. As you can see, the numbers below from years 1 through 5 are very optimistic. But this is only the beginning, and these values are not actual and more so assumed numbers. Setting aside what the thoughts of increasing revenue, as you saw in the previous slide, let me highlight the initial cost so that we can determine our cash flow and other possibilities. Outlined here is our capital expenditures and initial costs needed for the startup. These are also highlighted in detail in the budget proposal, which I've submitted under the CapEx line items. As you can see, the initial cost of this project will be $118,156 after tallying the total cost of equipment needed for the restaurant, office, staff room, as well as other startup costs identified in the project scenario. Since we know what our basis is and how much we need to initialize, we can determine whether this is a viable project by analyzing the expected cash flows based on the sales forecast to measure whether whether it will be profitable, how long it will take to return a profit, and determine the initial rate of return and the accounting rate of return. As stated, we wanted to determine the profitability of the business. So here are 4 analysis that measures its profitability. The first is the payback period, which determines how long it would take to absorb the initial cost of the project. As you can see, it takes slightly over a year to absorb the financed value of 118,000 plus. The net cash flow based on the present value factor of the net present value based on the present factor of 2% shows that you can acquire profits of more than 350,000 within 5 years. Now, a positive MPV is a good indicator of profitability, as highlighted here. Moreover, the ARR and the IRR also are good indicators that this business venture is definitely profitable. I do want to bring up one thing to your attention, that the IRR is higher, which may be an indicator of a higher risk. But since you can assume, and you've already heard before, high returns come with high risk. After determining what our sales forecast and profitability is, as well as the viability of the project, we provided several pro forma financial statements. The first that I'd like to go through is the income statement, which highlights your business income after the several expenditures assumptions that are taken into consideration. Remember that these figures are also an estimate. Wages, also estimate wages as well for your full staff as well as yourself. So the net income is the actual retained earnings of the business. As you can see here, each year after year, all of the expenses included, including interest and taxes paid for your business income, is more than your required $40,000 per year. Again, this is the retained earnings. This only supports why this is a viable business venture. Now, also, as highlighted, an annual increase. Also highlighted is an annual increase. I do want to inform you that early on, and I will address it later on again, that that the increase in the business net income does not support your initial requirement of your 2% increase annually based on the sales. And that's taken into consideration your net income, or what your forecasted net income would be. But as mentioned, the forecasted sales is merely a starting point and not conclusive of actual business. In reality, when analyzing the qualitative and quantitative numbers, less optimistic values and lower occupancy rates were taken into consideration. So you can look at this, or these numbers from years 1 through 5, as your lowest possible income values. Now, next up is the pro forma balance sheet, which introduces the financial strength of the business venture. As you can see highlighted here, the next 5 years, considering both your long-term, short-term, and operations, these values highlight your business assets. Based on these values, we perform 3 financial ratios that analyzes your working capital, liquidity, and return on equity. This will be highlighted as we conclude to summarize everything at the end. Now, to assume the projected operating cash flow and the annual cash budget, which will show you a higher number than your assumed net income from the pro forma income statement. These values are more realistic, are a more realistic measure than your sales forecast and income statement values. It introduces how money flows annually. This is fairly simple and straightforward since there are no cash cash from investments or financing considered. Only the interest paid as well as the taxes due have been calculated and included along with the depreciation expense for the property, plant, and equipment that you've acquired. As mentioned, the projected cash budget highlighted here is what we believe to be a more detailed examination of your operating budget. This introduces how much revenue your business will acquire, and what it will bring, and what you will retain every year, and what you will carry over in the following periods. As you can see here, it's slightly less optimistic than your initial sales forecasted results and initial analysis. But let alone, it's still very optimistic. Now, everything taken into consideration, leads us back to this point. Given here is the said scenario and requirements, as you can assume, we believe that this is a viable project to take on. Another set of analysis was provided or is provided here for you, where we calculated the NPV again, the payback period again, and the IRR based on your operating cash flow instead of the income statements. The payback period is slightly higher than the initial analysis, but it still falls within the 2-year range. The NPV, or the net present value, is also slightly lower, but it still shows a positive return based on the 2% present value factor. As mentioned, the net income does not support your required 2% increase of sales based on sales. But as you can see, the changes in net income is annually less than 1%. But that doesn't take away from why we believe that this is still a viable project. The financial ratio analysis are more optimistic measures, which calculates your working capital, which is in reality the measure of your liquidity based on what your current assets against your current liabilities is, or subtracted your current liabilities. The quick ratio here provided, which examines your liquidity. Moreover, it considers whether you can meet your short-term obligations for your operations. Basically, whether you can pay or be liquid enough to pay off your debts. A ratio of 1.1 is normally required by most companies, and you can see that your ratio is above this value. You have a 1.8 to 1, a 1.18 to 1 ratio. Now, the third financial ratio that we used was your REO. This considers the return on your net assets. It provides a measure of your ability to generate income based on your available equity, which is your assets. The returns above 15 to 20% are normally acceptable, and based on your provided situation, this is very viable. You can see here you have a 32.50, which is great. Now, as mentioned, the analysis performed based on this budget are assumptions, which has to be taken with a grain of salt. All other requirements, other than the requirements for your annual increase of 2% profit, based only on your business's net income, not on the other numbers provided or cash flows, are assumable, and these risks are everything else is very optimistic, and points to why we believe accepting this project is still can still present to be very profitable and very viable for you. Well, this concludes my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Although it was based on a hypothetical scenario, I did learn a lot from it. Because I believe that in developing and nurturing relationships, please add me and connect with me on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email to keep in touch. Since this is my last submission for the session, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, and as always, stay safe and be well.